The smell of wood smoke reached me before I even opened my eyes. It was not the warm, familiar kind that curled from our hearth on winter mornings. The kind that meant porridge was ready, and little Mara would come padding across the stone floor in her woolen socks, arms stretched wide, demanding to be held before the day began. No, this smoke was different. It carried iron in it, and distance, and something else I could not name, something that pressed against my ribs like a warning. I sat up in the dark and listened. The village of Ashford slept around me. I could hear it. Or rather, I could hear the absence of sound that meant people were pretending to sleep. The kind of silence that follows news no one wants to repeat out loud. 3 days had passed since the messenger arrived with the Alpha King's seal stamped in black wax on a rolled parchment. And 3 days had passed since that silence settled over us like a second winter. The tribute delegation was expected at Ironhold, King Roman's seat of power, by the first light of the 7th day. My mother, Etta, was the appointed village maid, the one who had served the delegation for 11 years running, who knew the roads, who knew the protocol, who had never once arrived late or empty-handed. She was also burning with fever and could not lift her head from the pillow without swaying. I pressed my palm to her forehead in the dark, and the heat that met my hand was enough to make my stomach drop. "Lily," her voice was barely a thread. "You must not." "Sleep," I said. "I'll handle it." I did not tell her what I was already planning. I did not tell her because she would have argued, and she would have been right, and I would have listened, and then nothing would have been done, and the village would have suffered the consequence of a missed tribute. I had seen what happened to villages that defied the king's summons, even unintentionally. The stories that filtered down through travelers and traders were enough. So I dressed in the dark. Linen underdress, the worn leather belt, my gray woolen cloak, the one with the fraying edge I had meant to mend for 3 seasons now. I braided my hair the way I always did, fingers moving from memory, looping the long blonde strands over and under until the plait fell across one shoulder. Then I gathered the tribute bundle my mother had already packed and tied at the foot of her bed, which told me, with a small ache, that she had prepared everything before falling ill. As if she had known. I stepped outside into the pre-dawn cold, and that was when I found Mara. She was sitting on top of the old gray pony, our old gray pony, the one we used for carrying firewood, with her small hands wrapped around the reins, and her chin lifted with an expression of absolute, devastating determination that I recognized because I had seen it in every polished surface I had ever looked into. She was 6 years old, dressed in her warmest cloak, and she had packed herself a small bundle of bread tied in a cloth. "Mara." I kept my voice low, controlled. "Get down. I'm coming with you." "You are not. Grandmother is sick and you are going alone." She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without drama, as though the logic was so obvious that arguing about it would be a waste of everyone's morning. I already saddled her. I know the knot. I looked at the knot. It was, in fact, correctly tied. I did not know whether to be proud or deeply, deeply frightened. "Mara, if you make me get down, I'll follow on foot." I stood in the cold for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the thatch above our door, and I thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. I thought about the road to Ironhold, which took most of a day. I thought about the Alpha King's court, which was not a place built for children. I thought about the wolves, both the animal kind and the other kind, that moved through those roads. And then I thought about the alternative, which was leaving my 6-year-old daughter alone in a house with a feverish grandmother, in a village where every able adult was too afraid of the king's summons to offer help. I took a breath. "You ride in front of me," I said. "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not touch anything. You do not look directly at anyone who looks dangerous. And in that court, most of them will look dangerous. Do you understand?" Mara nodded solemnly, as though I had just briefed her on military strategy. We left Ashford as the sky turned from black to the deep gray blue of very early morning, the pony's hooves quiet on the frost-hardened earth. Mara sat in front of me, her small back straight, her braid, a shorter, messier version of mine, whipping gently in the wind. She smelled of bread and sleep, and I kept one arm wrapped around her like a shield I was pretending was an embrace. The road to Ironhold was lined with old oaks that had grown into one another overhead, their bare branches weaving a lattice against the sky. We rode in silence for the first hour, and then Mara, because she was Mara, began asking questions. "Is the Alpha King very big? I've never seen him. Is he mean? I don't know. Will he be angry that I came?" I considered lying. "He may be. That is why you will be very quiet and very still. Like a mouse. Exactly like a mouse." She considered this. "Mice are actually very brave, you know. They go into places much bigger than them all the time." I tightened my arm around her and did not respond, because she was right, and it made my throat feel strange. We arrived at the outer gates of Ironhold territory as the midday bells were ringing from some tower I could not yet see. The gates were stone and iron, twice the height of the largest building in Ashford, and the guards who stood at them were built like people who had been designed specifically to make other people feel small. They wore the black and silver livery of King Roman's house, and their eyes moved over us with the particular combination of boredom and threat that only men with too much power and too little to do can perfect. I stopped the pony and lifted my chin. "I am Lily of Ashford, come in place of Etta the Maid, who is ill. I carry the village tribute as appointed." One of the guards stepped forward. His gaze went from me to the bundle, to the pony, and then down, with a visible shift in expression, to Mara. Mara looked back at him with absolute composure. The guard looked at me again. "You brought a child." "She is with me." "The king does not." "The tribute is here," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and I am the one who carried it. I have followed every summons requirement. What is between me and my daughter is my concern, not the territories." There was a long pause. Behind the guard, I could hear the sound of the inner courtyard. Horses, voices, the distant clang of a forge. The world of Ironhold, going about its day, indifferent to the two of us standing at its gate. The guard looked at Mara one more time, and Mara, 6 years old, sitting on a gray pony, tilted her head and said very politely, "Good afternoon, sir." Something shifted in the man's face. Not softness, exactly. More like surprise, finding a gap in armor he had forgotten he was wearing. He stepped aside. I exhaled, very slowly, so Mara would not hear it. We rode through the gates. The inner courtyard of Ironhold was everything Ashford was not. Vast, purposeful, loud with controlled activity. Warriors trained along the far wall. Servants moved in quick, practiced patterns between buildings. The stone was dark and ancient, and the banners that hung from every tower were black with a silver wolf. Everything here felt like it had been built to last beyond anyone's lifetime, to outlast questions and doubts and people who arrived on gray ponies with tribute bundles and daughters who asked too many questions. I had just dismounted and was lifting Mara down when I heard it. The courtyard did not go quiet all at once. It happened in a wave, starting from somewhere behind me and moving outward like ripples on still water, conversations dropping, footsteps slowing, the clang of the forge somehow diminishing, until the silence reached me, and I understood, from the way every person in that yard had turned to look at the same point, that someone had just walked through the far archway. I turned. He was exactly as tall as the story said, and then taller. Dark braids pulled back from a face that was all hard lines and careful stillness. Blue eyes moving across the courtyard with the specific quality of someone who cataloged everything, and revealed nothing. The leather armor was black, the fur mantle dark, the bearing of a man who had never once in his life had to announce his presence, because his presence announced itself. Alpha King Roman. His gaze swept the courtyard, and stopped. Not on me. On Mara, who was standing in the middle of his courtyard, bread bundle clutched to her chest, looking up at him with those wide, serious eyes, completely unafraid. And in the breath of silence that followed, before I could step forward or speak or explain, my daughter said, in a voice that carried clearly across every inch of that stone yard, "Are you the king? My grandmother got sick, so my mother came instead. She's very good. You should be nice to her." The entire court held its breath. King Roman's blue eyes moved, slowly, from my daughter to me, and I felt, in that moment, that I had never in my life been so thoroughly seen. I had imagined many ways this moment might unfold. In some versions, the guards stepped forward and removed us from the courtyard before the king even acknowledged our presence. In others, a steward appeared and directed us toward some back chamber where tribute was received without ceremony, without eye contact, without the particular terror of standing in open air while the most powerful alpha in the realm looked at you as though he was deciding something important. I had not imagined this. King Roman stood at the far end of the courtyard, and he did not move. He did not gesture to his guards. He did not turn away. He simply looked at me. Past Mara now, though I could see in the slight shift of his expression that she had registered somewhere, filed away, noted. And the silence stretched long enough that I became aware of every single person in that courtyard, watching to see what I would do next. So I did the only thing that made sense. I stepped forward, placed my right hand over my heart, and bowed my head. "My king, I am Lily of Ashford. I come in place of Etta, the appointed maid, who fell ill 3 days past and could not make the journey. I carry the village tribute in full, as required by the summons. I ask your pardon for any disruption my arrival may have caused." The words came out steadier than I felt. I kept my head lowered just long enough to be respectful, then raised it, because I had learned, from years of being overlooked and underestimated, that the moment you let your eyes drop too long, people stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as furniture. Roman's gaze held mine for a beat that felt longer than it was. Then he said, "Bring them inside." His voice was low and even, the kind that did not need volume to fill a space. 2 words, and the courtyard exhaled and resumed its motion. Guards shifting, servants moving, the forge resuming its rhythm as though nothing unusual had happened. A steward appeared at my elbow, a narrow man with sharp eyes and a gray tunic, and gestured toward the main hall with the efficient brevity of someone who managed chaos for a living. I reached for Mara's hand. She took it without being asked, which told me that even she had felt something in those 2 words. The Great Hall of Ironhold was a place built for intimidation, and it succeeded completely. The ceilings were high enough to hold weather in them. The long table that ran its center could have seated the entirety of Ashford twice over. Tapestries covered the stone walls, hunting scenes, battle scenes, a wolf mid-leap with silver thread catching the torchlight. Every surface said the same thing. Power lives here, has always lived here, will always live here. I had grown up in a house with 4 rooms and a leaking roof. I stood very straight. The steward, who introduced himself as Aldrich, the king's head of household, directed me to a chair near the far end of the table while Mara was guided, with surprising gentleness, to a smaller seat beside me. A servant brought warm bread and a clay cup of something that steamed, and Mara looked at it, then looked at me for permission. I gave a small nod. She wrapped both hands around the cup, with the focused solemnity of a child who understood, on some wordless level, that this was not the moment for her usual commentary. Aldrich set the tribute bundle on the table and began to inventory it with the practiced speed of someone who had done this hundreds of times. I watched him work, and tried not to look at the far end of the hall, where I was aware, in the way you are aware of heat from a fire even when your back is turned, that King Roman had entered and taken his seat at the head of the table. "The inventory matches," Aldrich said after a moment, without looking up. "Grain measure is full. Cloth bolts are the correct weight. Herb bundles are properly dried." A pause. "The record shows Etta of Ashford has made this journey 11 times. She has. And you are her daughter." "I am." He made a note on his parchment. "You've made this journey before?" "No. This is my first time." Aldrich looked up then, just briefly, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite assessment, but something between the two. He glanced at Mara, who was tearing her bread into careful pieces and arranging them in a pattern on the table. Then he looked back at his parchment and said nothing more. It was King Roman's voice that broke the silence. "Why did the village not send another adult in your mother's place?" I turned. He was watching me from the head of the table, one forearm resting on the carved wood, those blue eyes steady and direct. He asked it the way he seemed to do everything, without excess, without ornamentation, as though he had calculated exactly how many words a question required and used precisely that many. "There were others who could have come," I said carefully. "They chose not to." Chose not to. The summons carries the king's seal. People are afraid of what happens if something goes wrong on the road or in the court. They did not want the responsibility. But you did. I wanted my mother's name to remain in good standing. And I wanted the village to receive what it is owed under the tribute agreement, the grain stores, the healer's supply allocation. Those things matter to people who have very little. There was a pause. Roman studied me in that way he had, thorough, unhurried, as though he was reading something written in a language most people did not know existed. "How old are you?" he said. It was not quite a question. 24, my king. And your husband did not object to this journey?" The question landed quietly, but I felt it. "I have no husband." Something moved in his expression, so brief I almost missed it. Not pity. Something more careful than pity. "Then who watches your daughter when you work?" "My mother, when she is well. Or Mara comes with me." I glanced at her. She had finished her bread arrangement and was now examining the nearest tapestry with the focused attention of someone conducting serious research. She is accustomed to it. Roman followed my gaze to Mara, and for just a moment, the length of a single breath, the hardness in his face shifted into something I could not name, something that looked almost like recognition. Then it was gone, and he was looking at me again. "Your mother served this court faithfully," he said. 11 years without absence. She took great pride in it. As she should. He straightened in his chair. "Aldrich will see that you and the child are given a room in the east wing for the night. The road back to Ashford is not safe after dark, and the weather is turning." I blinked. "My king, that is not necessary. We can—" "It is not a request." The words were not harsh. They were simply final. The way stone is final. The way winter is final. I closed my mouth. Aldrich was already standing, already gesturing toward a corridor. I rose, and Mara slid from her chair and came to my side, slipping her hand into mine without being prompted. We followed the steward through corridors that smelled of old stone and pine resin, past doors I did not open, and windows that looked out over training grounds and dark forest. The east wing was quieter than the main hall. Tapestries here showed forests instead of battles, the colors softer, the torchlight less aggressive. It felt, almost, like a part of the castle that was resting. The room Aldrich showed us to was simply furnished but clean. A bed, a smaller cot that had been placed beside it with a blanket that looked newer than the rest, a basin of water, a candle already lit against the deepening afternoon dark. "Supper will be brought at dusk," Aldrich said from the doorway. "Is there anything the child requires?" I looked at Mara, who was examining the cot with an expression of deep personal satisfaction, as though this was all going exactly according to a plan she had made. "She's fine," I said. "Thank you." Aldrich nodded and left. I sat on the edge of the bed and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since before dawn. The room was warm. The candle made gentle shapes on the stone wall. Outside, I could hear the wind beginning to find its edges, the weather the king had mentioned, moving in from the north. "Mama." Mara climbed onto the cot, tucked her legs beneath her, and looked at me with those eyes that always seemed older than 6. "The king looked at you for a long time. Kings look at things they need to assess. He looked at you differently than he looked at everything else." I reached over and smoothed her braid where it had come loose from its tie. "Sleep, Mouse. It was a long day." She let me retuck the tie, but she did not look away, and in the candlelight her expression was the particular one she wore when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I think he's lonely," she said. I did not answer. I blew out the candle between us and listened to the wind against the shuttered window, and told myself, very firmly, that the observations of a 6-year-old about a king were not something I needed to consider. But in the dark, with the warmth of the room around us and the storm beginning to speak outside, I thought about blue eyes that had held mine without flinching, and I could not, entirely, disagree with her. I did not sleep well. The bed was softer than anything I had ever rested on, softer than the straw pallet at home, softer than the rolled blanket I used on the rare nights Mara kicked me to the edge of our shared space. And perhaps that was the problem. Comfort, when you are not accustomed to it, has a way of keeping you awake. You lie in it, and your body does not know what to do. So your mind fills the space instead, turning things over and over like a stone in a river. I thought about my mother, about whether her fever had broken, or whether old Widow Senna from the next lane had thought to check on her. I thought about the road home, and whether the storm that had howled against the shutters all night had left the paths passable. I thought about Aldrich's careful, measuring look when I told him this was my first time making the journey. And then, because I could not seem to stop myself, I thought about blue eyes at the head of a long table, asking questions with the precision of someone who already knew the answers and was simply verifying them. He looked at you differently than he looked at everything else. I turned onto my side and listened to Mara's steady breathing from the cot beside me until the darkness behind the shutters shifted from black to the deep gray that meant morning was considering its arrival. I rose before she woke. I washed my face in the basin. The water was cold now, the fire in the small hearth having burned down to embers, and rebraided my hair in the gray light, fingers moving through the familiar pattern. I was tying the end when I heard, from somewhere beyond the door, the sound of the castle waking. Boots on stone, distant voices, the particular rhythm of a large household resuming its purpose. I opened the door. The corridor was dim, the torches not yet relit, but there was a servant girl already moving at the far end, young, perhaps 16, carrying a bundle of fresh linens. She stopped when she saw me. "My lady, mistress, forgive me, I wasn't told you'd be." "I'm not a lady," I said gently. "I'm Lily, Etta's daughter, from Ashford. I was wondering if there was somewhere I might get warm water. For the child, when she wakes." The girl, who introduced herself as Petra, with the slightly breathless manner of someone who had recently been told to be useful and was taking the instruction very seriously, led me to a small alcove off the corridor, where a clay pot hung over a low fire, clearly kept burning through the night for exactly this kind of purpose. She filled a pitcher without being asked and handed it over, and then lingered in that way, Young people linger when they want to say something but haven't yet decided if they're allowed. "You're the one who came in yesterday," she said finally. "From Ashford, with the little girl." "I am." "Everyone in the kitchens is talking about it." She said it with the frank openness of someone who had not yet learned that information was currency. "About what she said to the king." I kept my expression neutral. "Is that so?" "Nobody talks to the king like that." Petra's eyes were wide. Not directly, not without being asked. The last person who spoke without being addressed first was a visiting Lord's herald, and Lord Aldrich had him removed from the hall. "She's 6, I said. "She doesn't know about removing." Petra smiled, quickly, as though she wasn't sure smiling was permitted, and then composed herself. "He didn't have her removed, though." "No," I agreed. "He didn't." I carried the warm water back to the room and found Mara sitting up on her cot, hair wildly disheveled, bread bundle open in her lap, eating the remaining piece she had saved from yesterday, with the calm efficiency of a child who had made peace with all circumstances. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Mouse. Come, let's make you presentable." She submitted to having her face washed and her hair rebraided with the stoic patience she reserved for necessary indignities, and I was just finishing the tie when a knock at the door announced Aldrich, who informed us with his usual economy of expression that the king had requested our presence at the morning meal before our departure. I looked at Mara. Mara looked at me. "Like a mouse," I reminded her quietly. She pressed her lips together, the gesture of someone taking a vow, and nodded. The morning meal was held not in the great hall, but in a smaller chamber off the main corridor. A room with a lower ceiling, and a single long window that looked out over the castle's inner garden, where frost still clung to the bare hedges. The table here was shorter, the atmosphere less cathedral, and there were perhaps 8 others already seated, captains by their bearing, an older man in the gray robes of a keep scholar, 2 women I did not recognize who wore the quiet competence of senior household staff. King Roman was already at the head of the table. He rose when we entered, a gesture so unexpected that I actually stopped walking for half a step before recovering, and the others at the table followed his lead, because that is what people do when a king stands. "Lily of Ashford," he said. "Be seated." I chose a place at the middle of the table, and Mara climbed into the chair beside me and immediately began studying everyone in the room with the systematic attention of a scholar conducting a survey. The meal was simple by court standards, I imagined. Dark bread, soft cheese, preserved fruit, a porridge that smelled of honey, and something warm I couldn't identify. But to me, it was more variety than our table saw in a week, and I ate carefully, watching Mara from the corner of my eye to make sure she was managing her portion with appropriate restraint. She was. She was also, I noticed, watching King Roman. He was speaking to the older scholar, something about a border dispute in the Northern Territories, supply routes, the loyalty of a garrison I had never heard of. His voice was measured, the words precise, and the men around him listened with the posture of people who understood that the quality of their attention was being noted. This was not a man who tolerated half-presence. But twice, in the space of that conversation, his gaze moved down the table to where we sat. The first time, it landed on Mara and stayed for just a moment, not threatening, but assessing, the way you might watch a bird that has landed somewhere unexpected, trying to determine if it intends to stay. The second time, it landed on me. I was looking at my porridge when it happened, and I felt it before I saw it. That particular quality of attention that has weight to it, that makes the back of your neck aware. I looked up, and our eyes met across the length of the table, and he did not look away. Neither did I, because I had learned, in 24 years of being overlooked and underestimated, that the moment you drop your gaze first, you become smaller, and I had no more room to shrink. After a moment, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more contained than that. An acknowledgement, perhaps. The recognition of someone who had noticed the same quality in another person and found it unexpectedly worth noting. He looked back to his scholar. I looked back to my porridge. Beside me, very quietly, Mara said, "He smiled at you." "He did not smile," I murmured. Almost smiled. "Eat your bread." After the meal, Aldrich brought our pony round from the stables, fed and brushed, looking considerably better rested than either of us. The storm had passed in the night and left the world scrubbed clean and very cold. The sky the pale hard blue of deep winter, every surface gleaming with last night's ice that was only now beginning to soften at the edges. I was tightening the saddle strap when I heard boots on stone behind me and felt the courtyard shift in that same wave-like way it had the previous afternoon. Attention redirecting, movement pausing. I turned. Roman stood a few feet away. He had come without announcement, without the full retinue, only 2 guards at a respectful distance, and Aldrich hovering at the edge of the courtyard with the expression of a man who had learned not to appear surprised by anything his king did. "The road to Ashford will be icy at the northern bend," Roman said. "Ride wide of the left edge. The bank drops there." I looked at him. "You know the road to Ashford?" "I know every road in my territory." There was no arrogance in it. It was simply a fact, stated with the same weight as everything else he said. This is what I am. This is what I do. "Thank you," I said. And then, because it was true, and because he had fed us and housed us, and not once treated us as an inconvenience, for everything, the room, the meals, I stopped, reorganized, started again. "My mother will want to thank you herself when she is recovered." "When Etta is recovered," he said, "tell her she has served this court with more consistency than most of my captains. That is worth more than she perhaps knows." Something tightened in my chest. "I'll tell her." He nodded. Then his gaze moved to Mara, who had been standing at my side, clutching her empty breadcloth, executing her mouse strategy with impressive commitment. He crouched down. The movement was so unexpected. The Alpha King of Ironhold, folding himself to the level of a 6-year-old in a frost-covered courtyard, that I heard one of the nearby guards make a small, involuntary sound of surprise. Roman looked at Mara directly, blue eyes steady, voice even. "You are brave," he said, "for coming on a long road to a strange place." Mara considered this seriously. "My mama was brave first," she said. "I just came with her." Something happened to his face then. Not the careful, almost smile from the table. Something quieter than that. Something that moved through his expression like light through water. Brief, deep, and gone before you could fully catch it. He straightened, looked at me one final time. "Safe road, Lily of Ashford." My name in his mouth, with the ice and the pale sky and the whole cold courtyard around us, sounded different than it had ever sounded before. Like it meant something. Like it was being remembered. "Safe road, my king," I said. I lifted Mara onto the pony, swung up behind her, and turned us toward the gate. We were halfway through it when Mara, who had been silent for a record-breaking 2 full minutes, spoke. "We're coming back," she announced, with the certainty of someone who has already seen how the story ends. I did not answer her, but I did not tell her she was wrong. 3 weeks passed before I saw him again. They were not quiet weeks. My mother recovered slowly. The fever broke on the 4th day after our return, but left her weakened in the way fevers sometimes do with people who have spent decades working harder than their bodies should have allowed. She slept more than she was awake for the first fortnight, and I took on her duties alongside my own, which meant rising before light and falling into bed long after dark, with Mara somewhere between those 2 points like a small, determined shadow. The village noticed our return, of course. Word had already spread, the way word always spread in Ashford, which was immediately, thoroughly, and with generous embellishment, that Etta's daughter had ridden to Ironhold alone with a child, and had not only delivered the tribute, but had been housed in the East Wing and seated at the king's morning table. Old Wren the Weaver stopped me in the lane on my second day back and looked at me with an expression I did not entirely know how to read. "They say the king spoke to you directly," she said. "He did." "And the child spoke to him." "She did." Wren was quiet for a moment, her hands working a length of wool she had been carrying, fingers moving with that automatic rhythm that old craftspeople have, the kind that means the hands are busy so the mind can be somewhere else entirely. "Your mother never mentioned that you had that kind of courage." "My mother knows better than to mention things people will disbelieve," I said, and moved on. But the truth was that I thought about it too. I turned the 2 days at Ironhold over in my mind during the long hours of physical work, scrubbing, carrying, mending, cooking, the way you turn a pebble in your palm, feeling its edges, not obsessively. Not with the particular ache that I told myself firmly was not what this was. More the way you return to something that does not yet have an explanation, that sits in the category of things I have not yet understood. Mara, for her part, talked about Ironhold with the casual frequency of someone who had simply added it to their regular map of the world. At supper, she would say things like the porridge at the castle had honey in it, or the king's courtyard is much bigger than the square, or, once, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "I wonder if the king has anyone to eat breakfast with." My mother, propped against her pillows and regaining her color by small degrees, listened to these comments with an expression that I recognized because it was the one she wore when she was thinking more than she was saying. "Tell me about him," she said one evening, when Mara had fallen asleep and the fire was low, and it was just the two of us in the quiet. "There's nothing to tell," I said. "He was courteous, formal. He honored your years of service, which I told you about." "I heard that part." She looked at me steadily. "Tell me the rest." "There is no rest, Mama." She made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated volumes, and closed her eyes, and said nothing more. But in the morning she started getting up earlier and insisting on taking back her smaller duties, which I suspected had less to do with recovery and more to do with freeing up my time for something she had decided, without telling me, that I needed. The summons came on a Tuesday. Not a tribute summons. Those came sealed in black wax, formal and collective, addressed to the village. This was a different kind of parchment. Smaller. Sealed in dark blue. Addressed not to Ashford but to Lily, daughter of Etta, Maid of Ashford. I opened it alone, standing in the lane outside our door in the thin winter sunlight, and read it twice. The Alpha King of Ironhold requests the presence of Lily of Ashford at the castle within the week, regarding a matter of household appointment. Travel arrangements have been made. A guard will arrive at dawn on Thursday. I stood very still for a long moment. Then I went inside, sat down at the table, and stared at the wall. My mother appeared in the doorway of her room, took one look at my face, and held out her hand for the parchment. I gave it to her. She read it, and her expression did something complicated that she smoothed away before I could fully catalog it. "Household appointment," she said. "That's what it says. That could mean many things. It could." She set the parchment on the table between us. Outside, I could hear Mara in the yard, talking to the pony in the serious, one-sided conversational way she had that made it seem like the pony was genuinely failing to keep up its end. My mother looked at the parchment, then at me, then at the window. "It means he noticed you," she said quietly. "It means the court needs a maid," I said. "You've done this work for 11 years. He's appointing a replacement while you recover." My mother looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided that love sometimes requires allowing people to believe their own simpler explanations for a little while longer. "Thursday," she said. "I'll press your good cloak." The guard who arrived at dawn on Thursday was a broad, quiet man named Owain, who rode a dark horse and said approximately 11 words across the entire journey, which suited me well enough. Mara was not with me this time. A decision that had taken 2 days of quiet, careful negotiation and ended with my mother promising her the first honey cake of spring in exchange for staying home without a scene. Mara had agreed with the dignified gravity of a diplomat finalizing a treaty. Ironhold looked different in the pale winter light than it had during the first visit. The same stone, the same banners, the same iron gates. But something in my perception of it had shifted. It was still vast, and still deliberately imposing, but it was also, I now knew, a place where a 6-year-old could address the king directly and be answered with respect. That knowledge changed its texture somehow, made the stone slightly less cold. Aldrich met me at the inner gate. "Lily of Ashford," he said, with the precise warmth of a man who keeps warmth in careful reserve. "The king will see you directly." I had expected to be taken to a receiving chamber, or perhaps back to the Great Hall. Instead, Aldrich led me through a corridor I had not seen before, narrower than the main passages, lined with shelves of scrolls and maps, smelling of parchment and the particular dry warmth of rooms that are inhabited and worked in. At the end of it was a heavy oak door, which Aldrich knocked on twice and then opened. The study beyond was not what I expected of a king. It was large, yes, but it was used. Maps spread across the central table with stones holding their corners, candles at various stages of burning, scrolls open and half read, a chair near the fire that had the worn-in look of something that had held the same person through many long nights. Bookshelves covered 2 walls, the volumes on them not decorative but clearly read, some with strips of leather marking pages, some stacked sideways where they'd been replaced quickly and without ceremony. On the floor near the table, inexplicably, was a single child's wooden horse, the kind a craftsman carves for market, sitting in the middle of the flagstones as though someone had set it down, meaning to move it, and then forgotten. Roman stood at the map table. He turned when Aldrich announced me. He was dressed more simply than during my first visit. Leather armor without the fur mantle, dark breeches, sleeves pushed to the elbows in the manner of someone who had been working rather than presiding. The braids were the same, the bearing the same. But something about the absence of the full formal appearance made the room feel smaller, more human. "Lily," he said. "Just my name. No title, no full address." "My king," I answered. He gestured to the chair across the map table. I sat. He remained standing, which should have made me feel smaller, and instead made me feel simply like myself, which was perhaps the same thing he had intended. "I have a proposition," he said. "My household lacks a senior maid with organizational knowledge of the keep's eastern stores and healing supply chains. Etta held that knowledge. I am told she taught you her methods." "She did, since I was a child. The position would require your residence at Ironhold. Quarters would be provided, better than those in the East Wing. A proper room in the household staff corridor, with a small adjoining chamber." He paused. "For the child, should she accompany you?" I looked at him. "You're offering Mara a room." "I'm offering you a position that does not require leaving her behind." The precision of it, the way he had identified the exact thing that would have made the offer impossible and removed it before I could raise it, was not lost on me. I sat with it for a moment, turning it over. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "I told you, the household requires—" "There are experienced maids in a dozen villages within a day's ride who could fill this position," I said. "Women who have spent years in castle service, who know court protocol, who have never stood in your courtyard looking like they were trying to remember how to breathe." I kept my voice level. "I have my mother's training and 2 days of observation, so I'm asking why." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone recalibrating, not because they were caught, but because they had not expected to need to explain something they had perhaps not yet fully explained to themselves. You came on a long road, he said finally, to a place that frightened you, for people who did not deserve the sacrifice, and you did it without asking for recognition or reward. And when you stood in this court, you stood straight. A pause. That is not as common as it should be. Outside the study window, the winter sky was white and still. The candles on the table made the maps glow amber. Somewhere in the castle, a bell rang the midday hour, distant and clear. I thought about my mother, pressing my cloak the night before with hands that were not yet fully steady. I thought about Mara, negotiating honeycake terms with the seriousness of a seasoned merchant. I thought about the wooden horse on the floor of a king's study, forgotten in the middle of the flagstones, and what it might mean that it was there. I'll need to speak with my mother, I said. Of course. And Mara will ask approximately 40 questions a day, and will at some point speak directly to you again without being addressed first. Something moved through his expression, that same quality I had seen in the courtyard, brief and deep. I am aware, he said. I find I don't object. I stood. He walked me to the door, and when I passed through it and turned back to acknowledge his courtesy, I found him already watching me with those steady blue eyes. Safe road, Lily of Ashford, he said. For the second time. And this time, I noticed, it sounded less like a farewell and more like a beginning. We moved to Ironhold on the last day of winter. My mother stood in the doorway of our house and watched Owain load the 2 bundles onto the cart. Everything Mara and I owned fit into 2 bundles, which said something about the life we were leaving and something else about the one we were moving toward. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman. But she held my face in both hands before I climbed up, the way she had done when I was small and frightened, and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. You were always braver than you knew, she said finally. I learned it from someone, I answered. She released me, turned to Mara, who received a kiss on the forehead and a whispered instruction I was not meant to hear, though I caught the words "watch over her" and felt something warm move through my chest. Then we were on the road, and Ashford grew small behind us, and Mara sat beside me on the cart with her bread bundle on her lap. She had refused to pack it with everything else, insisting it travel separately as luggage of personal importance, and watched the world go by with her characteristic expression of someone taking careful inventory. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and also, quietly, the best. Castle work was harder than village work in some ways, and easier in others. The eastern stores were a labyrinth that had been imperfectly organized for years. Healing supplies mixed with kitchen stores mixed with cloth allocations, records kept in 3 different hands with 3 different systems. I spent the first week simply mapping it, walking every corridor of the storage wing with a candle and a piece of chalk, marking shelves, making a list that grew longer each day. Aldrich watched this process with an expression that moved, over the course of that week, from cautious skepticism to something approaching respect. Your mother kept the same kind of lists, he told me on the 5th day. I know. She taught me that a household runs on what it can find quickly, not what it has in abundance. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when something confirms what they had already begun to suspect. Mara, meanwhile, adapted to Ironhold with the effortless flexibility of children, who treat new environments not as disruptions, but as expansions. She found the kitchen within an hour of arrival, and was on familiar terms with the head cook, a broad woman named Berta, by the end of the first day. She discovered the castle's small interior garden, dormant in winter, but with the ghost of what it would be in spring visible in the bare structure of its hedges, and declared it her territory for afternoon explorations. She also found, on her 3rd day, the study. I did not know about this until Aldrich came to find me in the storage wing with an expression that was carefully neutral. The child is in the king's study, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. Is she? She appears to be explaining the proper care of the wooden horse to the king, he said. He has not asked her to leave. I went. I stood in the doorway of the study and found Mara cross-legged on the flagstones, the carved wooden horse in her hands, delivering what appeared to be a detailed account of its structural qualities, while Roman sat in the worn chair by the fire and listened with the full, unhurried attention he gave to everything, as though a 6-year-old's assessment of a toy horse was information he genuinely required. He saw me in the doorway, said nothing. The corner of his mouth moved. I collected Mara, apologized with my eyes rather than words, and retreated. That evening, Roman found me in the storage corridor, where I was relabeling the herb bundles by season and potency. She's curious, he said, leaning in the doorway. She's relentless, I said. I'm sorry. I'll make sure she understands the study is... Don't. I looked up. He was watching me with that expression, the one I had catalogued across weeks now, the one that had no name I could find in any language I knew, but that meant I had come to understand that he was saying something true. The horse was my son's, he said. He passed 3 winters ago. Fever. The corridor was very quiet. The candle between us made shadows on the stone. I'm sorry, I said. Not the formal kind, the real kind. He nodded once. She handles it the way he used to, like it matters. He left before I could answer. But I stood in that corridor for a long time after, the herb bundle still in my hands, understanding something I had not understood before, about the loneliness that lived in a king's study, and why a worn chair by the fire looked the way it did, and why blue eyes that assessed everything did so with such particular attention to what was real and what was simply performance. Spring came to Ironhold like a slow exhale. The garden Mara had claimed through winter began to show its intentions. Green edges on bare branches, the first ground flowers pushing through the softened earth. She spent her afternoons there with a determination that suggested she was personally responsible for the season's progress. It was in that garden, on a late afternoon in early spring, that Roman found me. I was repairing a section of the herb border that the frost had damaged, hands in the cool soil, when I heard his boots on the stone path and felt the particular quality of attention that I had learned, over these months, to recognize at a distance. He sat on the low wall beside the border, did not speak immediately. We had developed across the winter a comfortable fluency with silence, the kind that does not require filling. The Eastern Store's inventory is finished, I said without looking up. Aldrich showed me. The healing supply chain needed complete restructuring. I've written a system that should hold for several years before it needs updating. I know. He told me that too. A pause. That's not why I'm here, Lily. I sat back on my heels and looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something gentle to the courtyard. The hard winter quality of it had softened. And in that light, with his elbows resting on his knees and his braids loose at the ends from a long day, he looked less like a king and more like a man who was tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. I have not been good at this, he said, at saying things plainly, when the things are not about territory or supply lines or garrison loyalty. You've been plain enough about most things, I said carefully. Not about this. He looked at me directly. You came into this court frightened and stood straight anyway. You have worked every day without seeking recognition. You have let your daughter carve out a piece of this place and made it feel, for the first time in 3 years, like this castle has something living in it beyond duty. He paused. I did not offer you this position only because the household needed a maid. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere above us, Mara's voice drifted from a window. She was telling Berta something elaborate about spring flowers. I know, I said softly. I want you to stay, he said. Not as staff, not as Etta's daughter fulfilling a post. His voice was steady, but underneath it was something careful and open, like a door held ajar by someone who is prepared, if necessary, to close it again. As mine, if you would have it. I looked at him for a long moment, at the blue eyes that did not waver, at the hands that had crouched to a child's level in a frost-covered courtyard and spoken to her like she mattered, at the man who had kept a wooden horse on the floor of his study for 3 winters, because moving it would have meant something he was not ready for. "Mara will continue to speak without being addressed," I said. "I know. And I will reorganize every storage system in this castle whether you ask me to or not. I'm counting on it." I reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, careful and certain at once, the way he did everything. "Then yes," I said, "I would have it." We married before summer. Not a grand ceremony. I had not wanted one, and Roman had not pushed for it, and in the end it was witnessed by Aldrich, Berta, Owain, and Mara, who wore her best cloak and stood very straight and did not speak until it was finished, at which point she announced to the assembled witnesses that she had known from the beginning and had simply been waiting for everyone else. My mother came. She sat in the garden where we held it, in the afternoon light, and watched with the expression of someone who has spent a long time carrying a quiet hope, and has finally, carefully, set it down. Roman placed his hand over mine during the words that were spoken, and when they were done, he looked at me the way he had looked at me in that first courtyard. Thoroughly, without flinching. And I understood that this was simply how he would always look at me. Like I was something worth seeing. That evening, after Mara had been put to bed and the castle had settled into its night rhythms, I stood at the window of what was now our chamber and looked out over Ironhold, the dark stone, the silver banners, the forest beyond the walls breathing its first real warmth. Roman came to stand beside me, said nothing, his shoulder against mine, steady and warm. Below in the garden, the spring flowers Mara had been supervising had opened fully, small and bright against the dark earth, exactly as she had insisted they would. I had come here frightened, on a gray pony, with a bread bundle and a daughter and a borrowed courage I wasn't sure I owned. I was leaving nothing, only arriving, finally, somewhere that knew my name. The candles burned low. The kingdom breathed around us. And for the first time in a very long time I was home.